I forgot to say, now it's time for Vincent to
That's fine, thanks.
Stuff.
Thanks a lot for the invitation. So what I'm going to do today is provide you with a very, very brief overview of the journal impact factor, a brief history, its limitations, and its adverse effects. So So what will I be talking about? So basically, generally, journal impact indicators, how did the GCR came as a main bibliometric indicator, then a few critiques and adverse effects of the indicators, and then I will conclude on why do we actually need, or do we need journal-level bibliometric indicators. So all of that started in the US, basically, the idea about compiling journal impact indicator. And there were two chemistry professors at a small college that basically wanted to help the libraries find the periodicals that they needed. And so basically, they tried to find what would the students need and what would the faculty need in terms of scholarly document. And they thought already in the 1920s that citation would provide an objective indicator. So basically, every faculty would come up with a different type, a different set of journals. And so they said, okay, we'll look at citation. That's going to combine all of the different point of view and come up with something that is relatively objective. And so what did they do? Well, they compiled the references made, of course, manually by the Journal of the American Chemical Society. They excluded journals' self-citations. And that meant, and this is quite interesting, when we know that today most of the science, or at least most of the science that is indexed, is published in English. In their list, most of the references were actually made to German journals rather than English journals. Of course, that excluded the Journal of the American Chemical Society, but we see that the situation that we have today is not something that was existing even in the natural sciences about 100 years ago. Then that was scaled up with sizable other studies. This is a table from a paper I wrote with one of my colleagues here, Eric Archambault. Basically, what we see is that several other studies have tried to scale this up to try to find references that are made to the various journals. And then typically it was only one field or a few subfields of the same discipline, and almost all of them were coming from the United States. And then comes the famous or the infamous Institute for Scientific Information, which provided the first large-scale citation index. And this was inspired by research, by a tool that was already existing in legal research that was called Shepard Citation. And so it was officially launched in 1964. And of course, the selection was based on Bradford's law. And what's quite interesting is that it took quite a few years for ISI to compile a genuine impact factor. So already, so in 1961, Garfield mentions, and there's a quote here, which I'm going to read. So basically, they mentioned the first time the journal impact factor, and they don't consider that as an indicator. They consider that as a correlation, which is basically a correlation between the number of papers that you publish and the number of citations that they receive. And so the first step in obtaining a more meaningful result of importance would be to divide the number of times a journal is cited by the number of times that articles that journal have been published. And so that's the first mention of a journal impact factor, but things kind of stay there until, well, actually Garfield gets scooped. So there's other researchers in the UK that basically take the ISI data and compile an indicator that is almost identical to what is currently the journal citation report. So Martin and Gilchrist basically take the Science Citation Index, only the subset of British scholarly journal. And this is where one of the very important feature, or one of the very important issues of the journal impact factor appears, which is the asymmetry between the numbers that are in the denominator and what's in the numerator, and also the 2-year citation window, which is still used in the main journal impact factor. So a few years after that, 1975, the first journal impact factor is being produced, or one might say published, because it's in a huge book where you've got all of the data table. And in the introduction of this big book, there's actually a few essays by Eugene Garfield that describes what is the interest, why did he created a journal citation report, why did he created a journal impact factor. And so he basically justifies citations as being an indicator of usage. So basically what he says, the more frequently a journal's articles are cited, the more the world scientific community implies that they find the journal to be a carrier of useful information. So this is clear that it's not to evaluate researchers, it's not to evaluate papers, it's to measure whether the journal carries useful information. And so basically states that librarians could use that information for subscriptions. And actually, he says that it would be very useful for researchers to use these indicators to help them decide where to publish and especially find multidisciplinary journals, so journals that would be at the frontiers of their research topics. And of course, he did not advocate for the JCR to be used to identify elite journals or that there would be anything about the quality of the scholarly journals. Which brings us to the impact factor itself. So it's a very simple calculation, a very simple ratio between two things. First, the number of citations that are received in a given year by the documents that are published in the journals for the 2 years before. And notice here that it's actually the document published, not the journals or not the articles or reviews. And it's divided by the number of articles and reviews that are published in the journal. So since at least the last 20 years, there's been an exponential growth in the literature on the journal impact factor. And what I wanted to discuss with you for the next about 5 minutes is to present a lot of the limitations that have been highlighted. This one is at the core of many of the issues with the indicator, and it's the asymmetry between what's counted in the numerator and denominator. So basically, that asymmetry leads to an overestimation of the impact factor of journals that publish a lot of front material, like editorials, letters to the editor, etc. So if you look at Science and Nature, for instance, their asymmetric impact factor is about 20 to 25% higher than a purely symmetric impact factor, where things that are at the numerator would be the same as what is in the denominator. So basically, that indicator has issues of calculation. It counts values in the numerator that are not in the denominator, which inflates the journal impact factor value. A second limitation, and we'll go back to its adverse effects later, is the inclusion of journal self-citations. And we see that it varies a lot across fields. So of course, smaller fields have higher journal self-citations than bigger fields, where basically there's more journals to cite. But overall, there's about 12% of cited references that are made to the same journal. Another important limitation is the skewness of the distribution. So as you're probably all aware, the journal impact factor is increasingly used not to assess journals, but to assess individual papers. But the problem is that citations do not follow a normal curve. They follow an asymmetric curve, where basically for any journal, you see that most papers receive very little citations, and that very few papers have high citation rates. And so basically what you have here are 4 journals that have very, very different impact factors, but in all of these cases, most papers actually receive low citation rates. So from a prediction point of view, it's actually very bad, because irrespective of where you're going to publish, you're much more likely to fall here in the lowly cited category than in the highly cited category. And then at the aggregate level, what we see is that for most journals, about 30% of papers obtain the journal impact factor value in terms of numbers of citations. So basically, for any given journal, 70% of papers don't reach the journal impact factor value in terms of citation. So that's a pretty bad predictor of the citations that are going to be received. Another limitation is the length of the citation window. So the JIF has a 2-year, then it's been expanded to 5 years, and then there's a multiplication of the various windows that can be used. But one thing is sure is that it leads to a lot of differences across fields. So if you take the field of psychology and the field of physics, what you see in physics is that citations rise quickly, and then they flatten more quickly than in psychology, where citations rise a bit more slowly, but then they don't really flatten. So when you actually compare journals from the two fields using a 2-year citation window, you're going to see that physics papers are much more cited, or physics journals are much more cited than those in psychology. But if you take a longer citation window, you're going to see that psychology journals are actually much more cited. Which leads me to the disciplinary comparison, which is an important one. So most, or unfortunately, in many cases, journal impact factors are analyzed without looking at the different disciplines, and what you see is that there's a lot of differences there. So the highest impact factor in clinical medicine is around 190, which means that papers basically receive 190 citations over a 2-year citation window, while in mathematics, it's around 1.44. And then you see similar things with the averages. And so again, a lot of heterogeneity there, where discipline plays a key role in citation dynamics and therefore affects the impact factor values. I'll skip this one quickly to discuss the declining predictive power. So I've discussed earlier that impact factor are increasingly used at the paper level as kind of a predictor of it. What we're seeing is that this predictive power is actually decreasing. So the journal impact factor is less and less a good predictor of the number of citations that a paper published in a journal will receive. And this is also exemplified when you look at the elite journals here, which see basically their share of top papers decreasing because there's an increasing diversity of scholarly journals at the world level. Another thing, and this is something that we see very often, is that publishers will say, okay, this year, most of our journals have increased our impact factor, so this is amazing. So Elsevier, of course, shows that. Wiley's is showing the same thing, so significant increases. And then Springer, of course, does the same thing. But what we see is that basically everything increases. So there's nothing to be there's nothing really impressive about. So what you have here are the distributions for 3 years, 1997, 2007, and 2016. So basically the tide rises all boats evenly. And so there's an inflation, and it works in the same manner for basically every publisher. So, of course, what I've mentioned, there's quite a lot of technical issues with the impact factor, and there are several indicators that have been created to correct those technical issues, the 5-year impact factor, the eigenfactor, SNP, site score, etc. But the key thing there is that most of the misuse of the journal impact factor is not related to its technicality. It's related to applying a journal level indicator to papers and researchers. And there's no level of sophistication that's going to solve this misuse. So over the last, I'd say 5 to 10 years, there's been quite a lot of documentation of adverse effects that the journal impact factors had on the scholarly community. And so one that is quite clear is that it has oriented researchers' publication strategy, and in some way it has oriented research topics. And so if my university tells me, Vincent, I want you to publish in the journal that has the highest impact factor, well, it's probably an American journal. And so it means that I need to focus on stuff that American journals are interested in, which are probably American topics. So this is going to influence the type of research that I'm going to do. And if I send my best paper to the American journal rather than the national journal or some other journal, then of course it weakens my national journal, and it weakens also in some way non-indexed scholarly journals. We've also seen quite a lot of impact factor engineering, so where basically editors and in some cases publishers are actually trying to optimize the citation window, publish the papers that are more likely to be cited in the beginning of the years, playing with the asymmetry between the numerator and denominator, and also, as you've probably seen, quite a few cases of coercive citations where editors have said, well, in order to be accepted, you need to cite these papers which are published in the same journals. We've witnessed, and this happens throughout the world, cash per publication policy. The Chinese case has been well documented, where basically if you publish a paper in Science and Nature in some universities in China, you're going to get a direct salary bonus that equals about 20 times the annual salary of a researcher in that country, which is, of course, a sizable bonus, which leads to quite a few disciplinary inequalities, because, of course, if you're in the social sciences, you cannot publish, or it's very difficult to publish in Science and Nature. And overall, there's been a multiplication of citation indicators, where basically anyone can probably find an indicator in which they look good, which leads to quite a lot of cynicism in the community. So, and this is also the other thing. So, of course, when something works well, there's a few imitations that have been appearing. So you might have seen these kind of false impact factors So the Global Institute for Scientific Information, which of course mimics the name of the Institute for Scientific Information, creating the global impact factor, which we have no idea how it's being compiled. The global impact factor, where you basically send money and they send you a number, which is the captain's age divided by whatever, we don't know. So to conclude, do we actually need the journal impact factor? So what is the problem that the journal impact factor solves in the scholarly community? I would say that it's information filtering and ranking, but I would believe that, at least at the paper level, we have much better indicators to do that. The journal impact factors has sizable effects. It reifies the role of journals, especially Anglo-American one, and this has a cost for the rest of the world, and you can tell that to your librarian. That has a sizable financial cost. And so I think that the community must ask, why do we actually, what is the use of the journal impact factor, and is it good for science? And more generally, and this is probably a bit more provocative, but all of the research evaluation era in which we are, is this actually good for science? Or are we actually harming it more than we're helping it? Thank you.